Hello there, everyone. I'm your host, the Sea Monster, and I bring to you all another little unscripted video of sorts, talking about a piece of Godzilla media. But rather, it's actually a piece of Godzilla media that I've already covered, technically speaking. So for those who don't know, in April of 2022, I did a two-part essay video series on Shin Godzilla, the 2016 film in the Godzilla franchise that also happened to be the film that started the Reiwa era. And let's just say I wasn't very positive about the film. While I did praise some of the visual elements in that film, particularly the ones involving Godzilla, I criticized the film for weak characterization and putting way more emphasis on social-political commentary over telling a well-crafted story. And to be honest, I still stand by those statements. But I basically just kind of moved on, with pride in what I put out there. That being said, there is a portion in Shin Godzilla that I didn't really touch on all that much, if at all, in my essay video series. And that is the climax of the film, where Rando Yagaji and company enact their plan, which is called the Yashiori Plan, which they commit to by pumping coagulant into Godzilla. And let's just say, after watching videos from a series called Shin Godzilla, A Fractured Diamond by fellow YouTuber C. Animus, as well as even just sort of thinking about the climax in its own right, just on my own time, I start to realize that, oh boy, this climax has some problems. Now, these issues, not all of them came up from me watching C. Animus's videos, particularly part 3 of his series of Shin Godzilla, A Fractured Diamond. There have also been other issues, that I also thought about in the film, that I may or may not have addressed in my essay video series when I was watching part 2 of his series, such as the fact that the surveyor and the helicopter didn't specify where those two old people were in proximity of Godzilla, when the Prime Minister is trying to decide whether to attack Godzilla at the beginning of the movie. That's one issue. But the climax was one that was a sequence that I didn't really put that much thought into. I just kind of figured that, okay, well, it's just kind of like the big spectacle of the whole thing. It's like, the plan seems like it makes, kind of enough sense, but I'm pretty sure there might be some issues here and there. I didn't really think much of it, admittedly. However, the more I thought about it, at least as of late, the more problems began to arise. First of all, some of the issues that C. Animus pointed out in part 3 of his Fractured Diamond series on Shin Godzilla regarding the climax of the film or the final reel, such as the fact that Goro Maki's riddle for our protagonist to solve didn't really affect anything or reflect all that much in our protagonists enacting their plan in the first place, which I do agree with. The fact that Godzilla, for some reason, is able to pretty much shift from one part of the area in which the climax takes place to another without any explanation, just so that certain payoffs can happen, such as him getting pinned down for the first time. The fact that the railroad tracks are pretty much destroyed in one shot but intact in another, that's definitely an issue for sure, compounded by the possibility that the reason why that issue is there is due to budget. That may very well also be true. However, those seem pretty minor in comparison to the biggest issues that I do have with the movie. First of all, the logistics of the trains coming up on Godzilla, the trains that are used that have explosives in them to wake Godzilla up or to disorient him or knock him down. C. Animus actually addressed this in his video, but I'll pretty much sort of cite him here, or at least do a paraphrase of it. How is it that a bunch of exploding trains are enough to take Godzilla down when firepower from tanks, heavy artillery, and bunker busters from jets couldn't even so much as make Godzilla flinch? Which causes the issue of the fact that Godzilla doesn't really seem very expressive, at least in that particular sequence in the earlier part of the film, in the second act. So the fact that a bunch of trains exploding on him are enough to do him in is just kind of ridiculous. Now, a bunch of buildings collapsing and falling in on him, that's one thing. Considering the height and overall mass that those buildings have, would certainly be enough to pin him down. But a bunch of exploding trains shouldn't do anything to him if heavy artillery couldn't. If you ask me, Godzilla should have been portrayed as being more responsive to the attacks that are taking place on him, like with the heavy artillery sequence, especially considering that he would go on to be responsive to attacks being inflicted on him just a few minutes after that anyways. Another issue is the trains going right up onto Godzilla as if there's a ramp there when there really isn't. It's as if they're just magically going right up on him, or that they just like started flying up in the air and just like explode, to explode on him. And it just kind of, like, the physics in there just look off. And I mean really off. Especially with those trains blowing up in Godzilla's face aren't even the bullet trains that we saw earlier in the sequence. But, alas, even those aren't the biggest issue in this sequence. No. There's an even bigger one, and if anything, this next, or perhaps final issue that I'm going to bring up with this climax pretty much breaks it. There's a point earlier in the film when a bunch of characters are watching surveillance footage from a drone that's just getting a layout of the area where Godzilla is. But just as it comes around the corner of some ruins, Godzilla, like an auto-defense system, shoots a laser at it, and the drone obviously goes offline because it's destroyed, and the characters are stunned by it. Which means Godzilla, even in his dormant state, has a sort of auto-defense system for anything that he may perceive to be a threat. Which raises the question, how come that auto-defense system never went off when those bullet trains started coming in? Or when the UAV drones were up in the air? But especially the bullet trains, the ones that start waking him up. The ones that disturb him in his dormant state. Let's just say if the auto-defense system went off, whether it's from his back or, as we see later in this sequence, his tail, after which had mutated to be able to shoot atomic breath like through his normal mouth, then the bullet trains would get destroyed before they would even reach Godzilla, and if those didn't make it, then the UAV drones, especially considering it's a clear sky, would also be in danger of it as well. Especially considering that since it's a clear sky, it's very likely that they could be seen from above, or at least detected by Godzilla. Now, of course, they could be just high enough to where they're out of range from where Godzilla is, but even then, that's not really the case, especially considering that Godzilla got attacked from something directly above him, from great heights before, which actually caused him to bleed earlier in the film. It would make me wonder how come the auto-defense system didn't detect the UAV drones as well, especially given that history. This is an immense oversight in Yaguchi's plan in taking down Godzilla. Because if the trains got destroyed, or the UAV drones got destroyed by Godzilla's auto-defense system before they even got to him, the plan would be dead in the water right from jump. Ergo, Yaguchi's plan would fail. Ergo, there goes Tokyo, go Godzilla. Because then the US would be given the A-OK to nuke Tokyo in order to destroy Godzilla, or at least attempt to. Basically, this one little scene of a surveillance drone getting destroyed by Godzilla, or at least footage from it, breaks the climax of this film. Meaning that the sequence where the film reaches its endgame is built on very flawed and downright even broken logic. Because otherwise, if they had adhered to that logic, we wouldn't have the happy ending. So basically, the climax in Shin Godzilla is heavily flawed. Not just in terms of Godzilla constantly going from point A to point B suddenly out of nowhere just for the sake of saving up time, to cut corners, just so that bits of payoff could end up happening. Not only are there some very questionable physics going on, and not only is there an issue that, as C. Animus puts it in his video, that coagulant shouldn't freeze Godzilla like it does at the end of the movie, but rather just freezes blood and give him like blood clots, which could potentially, or perhaps downright, result in a meltdown, because if there's nothing cooling him down, or if his source of cooling is cut off, he could overheat and explode, which would be ironic considering the Fukushima nuclear disaster being the result of something similar happening, and that's an event which inspired this film. But also, the climax is pretty much just broken before it even began due to an earlier scene that establishes Godzilla having an auto-defense system that essentially breaks the climax. And yet for some reason he doesn't use it to defend himself because the script requires it. And all that brings us to a close regarding Shin Godzilla, which unfortunately I can't say is a good movie overall. Like, it just doesn't hold up. There's certainly some good elements in it here and there, and I don't doubt that this movie had its heart in the right place in areas, but unfortunately, the script just has too many flaws for me to overlook. It's certainly not the worst Godzilla movie, not by any stretch, but I can never call this movie one of the best films in the series either. It's definitely in the lower tier for sure in the franchise, if you were to ask me. Again, not quite at the lowest end of it, but it's still not very good. And with that said, that pretty much ends this little addendum thing that I have going on that's pretty unscripted on Shin Godzilla. You could say that this might even be like part 3 or part 2.5 or epilogue on my essay video series on Shin Godzilla. Yeah, take it as you will, regarding that. But I could certainly chalk this one up as being part of it for sure at the end of the day, because it is talking about a significant part of the film itself. So with that said, it's safe to say that I am done talking about Shin Godzilla as far as, talking about it as the main subject. I may make references to it here and there, perhaps in future videos, but as far as having it be the main subject, this is pretty much going to be my last hurrah in that front. I don't plan on pretty much talking about this movie to death on this channel. Well, I could, but I'm going to choose not to, pretty much, after this. Unless I were to use it as a reference, for either as a positive example or a negative example, whichever one. But from here on out, this is it. This is pretty much a little addendum on my essay video series on Shin Godzilla, and I guess I'll just bring that all to a close. Hope you all found this one to be worthwhile. Thank you for watching, and until my next video or next essay video series, I will see you all later.